Where did the strange and terrifying behavior begin? Although there's no certain answer, some think the paintings of the Middle Ages provide a clue.
In medieval art, the mouth of hell is so often depicted as the mouth of a great monster with flames inside it and the damned dropping down the monster's throat into the flame. So it seems natural that there is an association between hellfire and dragonfire so far as Christian dragons are concerned.
Images of dragons flooded the medieval world. They appeared in folk art, popular legends, and illuminated manuscripts. But of all the dragon images, none is more incongruous than the gargoyle. How did the monstrous dragon come to guard the very house of God?
It's fascinating to consider that at the same time the church is slaying dragons, trying to put down old religions perhaps, or control sexuality, at the same time it flings open the doors of its cathedrals and asks the dragons in the form of gargoyles. It's really quite mysterious to wonder how they get from the dragon as evil to the dragon as the protector of the cathedral.
According to legend, it all started in medieval France, in the city of Rouen. One morning, a monstrous water dragon emerged, vile and slime-covered, from the Seine River. The beast surveyed the city. Then, from its gaping mouth, it spewed a torrent of water. The townspeople called him the Gargler, and all fled before it, fearing a watery death. All that is except the archbishop. He confronted the beast with the sign of a cross. Instantly, the water dragon sank down, its fury extinguished. From that day on, the drain spouts of the cathedral were carved to depict the Gargler. We call them gargoyles. Chinese dragons. They dominate architecture, fabric, and ceramics. Since dragons are thought to bring good fortune, they've long been honored in ancient folk festivals and traditional New Year celebrations. For thousands of years, Chinese dragons have been sacred symbols of change, able to make themselves as small as silkworms or large enough to fill the space between heaven and earth. Even more remarkably, dragons were thought to govern the essential rhythms of Chinese society. Ancient tradition says that dragons water the rice fields, providing the cornerstone of Chinese civilization. Yet, Chinese dragons have a destructive side, too. They're also thought to deliver the devastating storms that regularly batter China's shores. Why would the life-giving dragon release such deadly tempests? What affront could humans have committed to merit this punishment? In In fact, according to Chinese folklore, mortal behavior has nothing to do with it. Peasants tell stories of dragon kings, noble animals that live in aquatic palaces on the ocean floor. In the spring, dragons ascend to the heavens. In the autumn, they return to their undersea homes. These seasonal passages are said to stir up China's destructive storms. Far from the tempests of everyday life stands China's Forbidden City, the emperor's exclusive palace. It is adorned with dragons. Why? How was this idol of the peasantry welcomed into the royal household? Thousands of years ago, a lowly soldier of fortune named Liu Pang rose to the pinnacle of Chinese society. He was poised to become emperor, the son of heaven. But Liu Pang had a problem. His common origins did not bode well in tradition-bound China. The founder of a great dynasty needed a great lineage. So, Liu Pang invented one. He claimed to descend from dragons.
When Liu Bang and his associates took power, they felt the need to justify, to legitimize this new dynasty and to upgrade Liu Bang's nobility. Therefore, they give this new component of dragon mythology. And from that day onward, the dragon became the symbol of imperial power.
Curiously, the emperor's dragon was always depicted with 5 claws. This creature became so wedded to the imperial identity that before long, every feature of the Chinese court was described in terms of dragons. The emperor was called the True Dragon. He sat on the dragon throne and wrapped himself in dragon robes. So jealously did the royal household guard its 5-clawed dragon that anyone who displayed the symbol without approval was punished by death. Why did Chinese dragons become civilized, even regal, while their Western cousins remained marauding brutes?
My best guess for why Chinese dragons are different from Western dragons has to do probably with the way that the two cultures regard nature. We in the West have tended to regard nature as something to be conquered and overmastered by force. Whereas the Chinese, on the other hand, tend to be much more in accord with nature.
Some experts object to comparisons between Eastern and Western dragons. China's dragon mythology may have developed 6,000 years ago, long before dragon stories emerged in the West. Chinese and Western dragons act differently, these scholars say, because they are totally unrelated.
We have to start at the very basic question that the Chinese dragon and the Western dragon are not the same thing. The Chinese, because by using the very English term, the English word dragon, we have a wrong impression that dragons all over the world are the same in nature. In fact, they are not.
Perhaps cultural attitudes towards nature are less important than nature itself. Might Eastern dragons be unique because they're based on Eastern animals? And if so, might other continents harbor different creatures? When we return, could this skeleton be the remains of a real dragon? It was August 1675. The French missionary Father Jacques Marquette and a group of explorers were canoeing down the Mississippi River. As they rounded a bend, the men fell into the shadow of a tall cliff. They cast their gaze upwards. There, the astonished party beheld two monstrous dragons painted on the limestone rocks. The picture, according to their Indian guide, had been painted hundreds of years earlier. It depicted a monster called Pyasa, a huge winged animal said to devour humans. How could this creature of ancient American folklore look and act so much like the dragons of Europe? What can explain the baffling similarities between Old and New World dragons?
And that's quite a mystery to us. Are the people there thinking of them on their own, or have they had some sort of contact with the cultures of the Old World?
The Pyasa wasn't the only dragon-like beast of the New World. Other European explorers reported myths throughout the Americas featuring snakes with horns or wings. The most striking New World dragon of all, however, arose further south, in the land of the Aztecs. These are the pyramids of Teotihuacan, standing just 25 miles outside Mexico City. It was here that Aztec priests worshipped their gods and practiced human sacrifice. The monuments at Teotihuacan are carved with deities, shells, and a dragon called Quetzalcoatl. Where did he come from? Why does a dragon adorn one of the most sacred sites of Aztec civilization? The answer begins with a strange paradox. While dragons of the Old World were monstrous demons, the Aztec dragon was a god. Far from threatening civilization, the dragon Quetzalcoatl was revered for founding it. According to Aztec legend, Quetzalcoatl launched Aztec culture. He brought writing and agriculture to the land that is now Mexico. Tradition held that Quetzalcoatl once actually governed the land of the Aztecs in the form of a man. The mortal Quetzalcoatl had light skin and hair. One day, stalked by enemies, he fled his native land. As he departed, Quetzalcoatl vowed to return. Hundreds of years later, in 1519, that promise seemed fulfilled. When the king of the Aztecs saw a fleet of ships arriving on his shores, he welcomed their light-skinned leader as the returning dragon, Quetzalcoatl, in human form. The strangers were in fact Spanish conquistadors. Within 2 years, the Aztec kingdom had been destroyed. European domination of the Americas had begun. How did dragon stories predate the European invasion? What can explain the existence of dragons in the Americas at least several hundred years before Europeans first arrived? Surprisingly, some theorize that the answer may lie with an actual creature. And in 1972, a remarkable discovery not far from the land of the Aztecs lent credibility to the idea. In that year, archaeologists uncovered the fossil remains of the largest animal that ever flew. With a wingspan of 50 feet, the creature would have resembled a bat the size of a small airplane. It was categorized as a pterosaur, a flying reptile.
It's possible that bones were found, fossils were found of a large pterosaur, perhaps more than once, and that these were identified as a flying animal, and they may have concluded these things were flying dragons. And that may well have happened, for example, in Mexico.
Could the Aztecs have found similar remains centuries earlier? Some scholars are doubtful.
Is this the motivation for the Indian myths? I'd say the chances of that are close to zero, for the reasons that at least we've only discovered it very recently. And when we discovered it, we only found a few fragments of bones initially that wouldn't look like a giant flying reptile unless you already knew a lot about them.
Even if the Aztecs did find a complete skeleton, it's unlikely they would have recognized the bones as those of a flying giant. By looking for dragons in the fossil record, some experts argue we're ignoring a bigger mystery.
Even if a dinosaur fossil was the motivation for a dragon, a bunch of people had found one of these things and said, golly, there's something big and giant and scary, and that led to the myth of dragons. In some respects, it's the least interesting part of the explanation. The question is, what have we done with dragons? The way we've embellished them, the role they play in our culture. And to my mind, that's what's particularly interesting about them.
Despite modern skepticism, men of science throughout history have compiled intriguing evidence for the actual existence of dragons. Miraculous visions and ancient folklore convinced many people that dragons were real. For the skeptics, there was even more persuasive evidence: eyewitness encounters. The Greek scholar Herodotus is known as the father of modern history. In the 5th century BC, he crisscrossed the ancient world, seeking answers to many questions of his day.
I went once to a certain place in Arabia to make inquiries concerning the winged serpent. Herodotus.
During his life, Herodotus pursued many insoluble puzzles. In his mind, however, the issue of flying serpents had been resolved. When he returned from Arabia, Herodotus confirmed that dragons were real.
Vipers are found in all parts of the world, but winged serpents are nowhere seen except in Arabia. If they increased as fast as their nature would allow, impossible would it for man to maintain himself on the earth. Herodotus.
What can explain these baffling claims?
One of the things that's so mysterious is why all of these cultures around the world should keep reporting this same animal that doesn't seem to exist. If you look at traditions of medicine and magic, you find that very many parts of the dragon were considered medicinally useful. If you ate the heart of a dragon, you would understand the language of animals. If you sowed the teeth of a dragon, you could raise up new citizens for your city. It may be that dragons really did exist and they were so valuable they were simply hunted to extinction.
As the centuries passed and European travelers scattered across the horizons, they refuted many age-old assumptions. But dragons would not die. In fact, the legend grew. World-wise travelers returned with detailed descriptions of the horrible beasts.
Investigators of nature do say that dragons have 15 teeth of a side. Their bodies are set all over with very sharp scales, and their tongue is cloven, as it were double. Edward Topsell, 1658.
Even Marco Polo, perhaps the most credible explorer of his age, told of dragon-like beasts. Upon returning from Asia, he described his first-hand encounter with enormous serpents. The beasts, he said, had 2 feet and a devastating claw. How can we explain such reputable reports echoing throughout the centuries? Could these men have been reporting actual species of animals? Certainly, as Europeans began to explore distant lands, many creatures would have seemed fabulous. With only hearsay as a model, elephants appeared in strange and exaggerated forms. Large reptiles also looked incredible. Might medieval sightings be explained by these exotic creatures?
One of the characteristics of dragons are these big scales, and I would say that alligators and crocodiles easily fit that. They've got little bony pieces in their skin. They clearly look like things that are hard to penetrate.
Might something even more exotic lie behind the dragon myth? In the Indian Ocean, an archipelago called the Lesser Sunda Islands stretches from Java to Australia. Remote from the outside world for centuries, islanders were steeped in the supernatural. Most vividly of all, they were haunted by tales of dragons. They told of a beast sheathed in scales and armed with deadly talons. An animal said to stalk humans. Westerners dismissed these stories as superstition until 1912. That was the year a Dutch army officer came face to face with a real dragon. Awestruck zoologists identified the 10-foot animal as a monitor lizard, the largest ever encountered. They dubbed it the Komodo dragon. Is this living myth the key to dragon legends? Could there be other animals even more incredible still walking the earth?
And it is possible that a living animal, either a giant monitor or a surviving dinosaur, however unlikely that may seem, could have given rise to dragon folklore in Mesopotamia and other Middle Eastern cultures and later in medieval Europe.
A living dragon-like dinosaur? It would not be the first time in our century that a creature dismissed as extinct has been discovered alive. The coelacanth fish allegedly died out millions of years ago. But in 1938, a fisherman caught a living specimen. The short-necked giraffe depicted in ancient art was never thought to be real. Never, that is, until modern Europeans caught one. The animal is now called okapi. If these fabulous animals live in the flesh, perhaps science has too rapidly dismissed the dragon. That thought has animated a new generation of explorers. Calling themselves cryptozoologists, men like Richard Greenwell travel the globe, tracking reports of unknown animals.
In Africa, for example, there's this animal called Mokele Mbembe that supposedly lives in the swamps of Central Africa in the Congo. And people, according to the descriptions, people have proposed that it's a surviving sauropod dinosaur.
Could sauropod dinosaurs, creatures resembling dragons, have survived into modern times? Richard Greenwell traveled to the Congo to find out.
If you fly over it, it's just an enormous area and all you see is tree canopy. There could be anything in there. That doesn't mean there is. But if you're looking for modern dragons, I guess that's one of the places to go. To a place that's very hard to get in and out of, that's still zoologically not very well known. And that's where you might find a so-called living dragon.
The trek was long. The evidence elusive. In the end, Greenwell didn't find a dragon-like creature. But he retains his belief that science still has much to learn.
If there are unknown animals, unknown to
Wow, fairy tales.
From time immemorial, there was a place where humans
Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Beijing. You enjoy your stay in China. Thank you.
北京，我来了。 观众朋友们，让我们再次用热烈的掌声感谢他们，好吗？请裁判员准备试分。
I was born in the year of the dragon, but I didn't know that until I was 22. When I was growing up, I used to pretend to kill dragons because dragons were bad, dragons were evil. The image of the dragon is not the same everywhere. I think it's a great example of how culture shapes the way we think, and how learning about other cultures can open new windows to other ways of seeing things. So let's talk about the Chinese dragon and the let's call it the Western dragon. There are a few similarities between them, but I think more differences, and both of these can give us some really interesting insights. What do the Western dragon and the Chinese dragon have in common? That means, what do they share? Well, they're powerful creatures that are generally kind of snake-like, and usually they have scales. They both seem to have a connection to wealth and fortune, but not in the same way. We'll talk about that more later. Actually, cultures around the world have legends about dragons, but as I said, we'll focus on the West and China. So first, the Chinese dragon. In Chinese culture, dragons symbolize power and good fortune. So it makes sense that dragons were the symbol of the emperor in Chinese dynasties. Being born in the year of the dragon is, I'm told, something to be proud of. Most dragons in Chinese culture can fly, but generally not with wings. They fly with magic. In my opinion, Chinese dragons look super duper cool. The Western dragon, by contrast, is the embodiment of evil. That's a nice phrase. You can use that one for people you don't like. The embodiment of pure evil. The absolute worst creatures. They guard gold selfishly, as well as beautiful women. They breathe fire. They have wings. They're huge and horrifying creatures that will burn your village just because they want to, because they're bad. They're very, very bad. This is the traditional image of the Western dragon. The most brave and heroic thing any hero can do is kill the dragon, get the gold, and save the village. Oh, and save the girl. In one of the earliest English stories, Beowulf, the hero, fights a dragon to save his people. This is the image I grew up with, and there really aren't many exceptions. So, what can these similarities and differences teach us about culture and the stories we tell? Well, in both cases, I think dragons are tools to shape culture, but tools used in different ways. I find it interesting that in both cases, they symbolize power. The power symbolized by dragons is supernatural, not something ordinary humans can ever have or even completely understand. But power is a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. In the West, the dragon's power is terrifying. It symbolizes the scary unknown, the things that frighten us most, which we can't really understand. These are embodied in the dragon. It's really the perfect thing to hang all our fears on. When terrible things happen, it's nice to be able to say, dragon, bad. It was the dragon. It was a dragon who did this. I think also Western dragons represent the worst things about ourselves. Dragons are what happens when power meets total selfishness. If you had unlimited power, wouldn't you swim around on a mountain of gold? I think probably I would. It's greed for the sake of greed. Dragons have no real use for the gold or the girls. They can't buy things on Amazon. The Western dragon shows us the extremes of our worst characteristics, the worst things about ourselves. So we need to kill the dragon to teach our children that these things can be defeated, but only the bravest and strongest person can do it. We have to be strong in order to defeat these things, these bad things, in ourselves. We have to protect the village from what we might become if we didn't try our best to become more like the dragon-killing hero. On the other side, there's the Chinese dragon. The other side of power is the good side, the side that stands for order and law. Without great power, how can any leader keep the nation from falling? The power of the dragon symbolizes the power to rule an entire kingdom with a firm but fair hand. With a strong ruler, the nation can be strong. When the nation is strong, good fortune will follow. The symbol of the dragon in China is like a power-up in a video game. It's something you need to do the job of emperoring well. I think Game of Thrones brings these two ideas together in a way. Daenerys' dragons are pretty scary, but they also give her the power to be a leader. The dragons in Game of Thrones are as close as I've seen to dragons that blend the Western and Chinese conceptions. Well, the ones in How to Train Your Dragon are also friends with humans, but those aren't really dragons. They're more like flying cats with scales.
How an unorthodox dragon made everyone cry, defying all expectations. Hi everyone, All Things D&D is back with another story. Does a green dragon need to be evil? If a certain black dragon found their own path, maybe there's hope for other dragons to do the same. Listen to the story of a green dragon finding their own way and defying all expectations. I watched from the cover of the trees as the elves passed me by along the dirt road. They were traveling with a small horse-drawn carriage towards the nearby settlement. A small town of theirs deep inside the forest, where no men or orcs ever visited. It was a family of them, I think. A mother, a father, and two small elf children who scampered around the cart, which only reminded me of my own family, as one of my claws flexed and left a furrow in the forest loam beneath my feet. I was the smallest of two siblings, hatched to two of the most cunning green dragons in existence. My mother and father had taught me and my brother everything that they could, but I had always been smaller and weaker. And worse, in my parents' eyes, I was not cunning at all. My parents had told us time and again that a green dragon's fame and fortune rested on how well they could lie and manipulate any situation to their advantage. They told me legends of our ancestors, who through their wits and guile had laid waste to entire kingdoms with mere words, and had lured foolish elves and men aplenty into their waiting jaws. A dragon who could lie convincingly would never go hungry, they said. Which was why I was always the weakest, the runt, the failure. No matter how many times father or mother showed me or taught me, I just could not lie convincingly. Nor could I tell when anyone was lying to me in turn. And my oldest brother showed me no mercy for it either. He always tricked me into getting lost in the forest, or eating something that had been dead for a week. My parents gave up on me long before I left the nest. They called me a lost cause, and I was remitted to eating the leftovers of every successful hunt and kill. Even in my first true hunting lesson, I was a failure. We were supposed to ambush traveling merchants, who were lost in our forest. Father managed to scatter them easily enough, but when I confronted the pair who had wandered in my direction, I failed. My task was simply to lure them into a thicket, where they would be trapped, and I could eat them. But when I had talked to them from inside the thicket, promising shelter and safety using the phrase in the common tongue Father had taught us, they had simply run away. And I am ashamed to admit, I lost track of them in our own forest. I returned to my family as they were gorging themselves on horses and men, empty-handed. And between mouthfuls, my brother mocked and laughed at my failure again. My humiliation was complete, as Mother threw the severed hindquarters of a horse at me and told me to leave the successful dragons to their feast of man-flesh. It was not long after that my parents had driven me from the forest, telling me in no uncertain terms that they would kill me if I returned to their territory, and I believed them. So it was that I had flown as far as I could, and collapsed from exhaustion in the forest I was now living in. It wasn't a bad forest, all things considered. It was far from any major city, so no knights or adventurers would come hunting for me, and I had kept a low profile by eating only the deer and wildlife the whole 2 decades I had been here so far, despite having a settlement of elves nearby. Which brought my attention back to the present for a moment. I sniffed the air, and the tantalizing scent of elves met my nostrils again. Elves were a delicacy. My mother and father had not found many in the forest near where I hatched, for it was far from the wilder forest they liked to live in. But the few times they had brought pieces back together, they had been the tastiest food of all. Mother and father had told us that they were the tastiest and most prized food of all for a reason, because green dragons and elves had been at war with each other for generations, beyond memory even of dragon kind. They had also warned us as well, that while men or any other of the 2-legged races might believe our lies, elves never would, and would slay us given even half a chance. Without hesitation or mercy, the blood feud between our species was just that strong. So it was that as the family of elves passed in front of me, I was preparing to make the first large gamble of my life. Instead of trying to lure them away from the road, I was going to attack them right there. I had at first considered allowing them to pass, but the deer had been avoiding my area of the forest of late, and I was growing desperately hungry. I figured that if I took out the male, the female would be helpless, and while the children didn't register as a threat and didn't seem very filling, I knew I would have to silence them too, or else risk my presence being revealed to the nearby settlement. I readied myself to leap and pounce on the male, my mouth already watering from what was to come. And then the most unexpected thing happened. The little girl, who had been running circles around the family, tripped over a stone in the road and fell to the ground. And then she began to cry. I paused before springing, wondering how this would change my plans, and observing how the family would react to their youngest member's behavior. Would they scold her? Yell at her for being weak? Would her older brother torment her? Would they leave her behind? My expectations were shattered when the entire family stopped to help her back to her feet, and I watched in confusion as they hugged and kissed their youngest, all while talking to her in a friendly manner. Were they lying to her, only to bring her more torment? Even though I was terrible at discerning tricks, something about their mannerisms told me that this was not so. I was befuddled and in complete confusion as the father picked up the daughter and carried her, in addition to leading the horse cart and carrying his belongings, adding her to his own substantial burden. And then even more confused, as the older brother asked to help carry some of his father's burden in turn. I was so confused by their behavior that I didn't even notice my opportunity to pounce had passed until long after they were farther down the road. And when I did, I cursed my own weakness and hesitation as my unsatisfied appetite grumbled and complained. But I still couldn't get the image out of my head of the family of elves stopping to help their fallen and weakest member. Several days passed after I failed to ambush the elves on the road. I spent most of my time in or around the small cave I had chosen for my lair. A few hunts for deer each day finally rewarded me with a sick buck that was wandering the forest alone, and I killed and ate it without reserve. For I knew few diseases could touch me, and my kind is absolutely immune to any poison. But the memory of the elf family tormented me in a way I couldn't even describe to myself. Why were they the way they were? Every time my own family had observed my failures or discomfort, they had laughed at me or yelled at me or tormented me more, especially if they were the source of my troubles, because I was the failure. But at least I understood why they treated me that way. I was expected to become strong and cunning, and instead I was the weakest of our kind that had been hatched in a dozen millennia, they told me. And they were just trying to toughen me up and make me smarter. So why was it that when the elf child had been in distress, they had done none of that, but had instead checked on her health and even carried her? Nothing made sense. After several days of these thoughts, I decided that at the very least, I didn't know as much as I should about elves and their warped ways, and I decided that I would observe them in their settlement. After all, if I was going to live so close to my mortal enemy, I should know as much about them as I could. Early the next morning, I decided to stalk down to the elven settlement and watch them for the day. As I neared my destination, the smell of elves in the air became more predominant, and I could have just followed my nose if I had been lost. Luckily, these elves had built their homes in a grove of ancient and giant trees, and most of the area around their homes was infested with undergrowth and shrubbery that I could hide in easily. And I soon found myself crouching in the undergrowth, near one of their vegetable gardens. The sound of elves going about their day surrounded me shortly after sunrise, and I realized quickly just how many seemed to live here. They descended from their homes in the trees